Thank you everyone for staying with us for the panel. I'll just very briefly introduce the panel. We've got 50 minutes if we stay until 9 o'clock. So first here we have Patricia Pino, and I've just got your notes here. Your PhD candidate at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, an economist and an engineer, and an educational content creator, it says, which I think means podcaster these days. Josh Ryan Collins is Associate Professor in Economics and Finance at the Institute of Innovation and Public Purpose, a well-rounded economist who will be discussing one of his principal areas of concern tonight, money and banking. Zack Polanski is Deputy Leader of the Green Party and a Green Party London Assembly member. He's worked in prisons, schools, universities and nightclubs. I think we've met somewhere before.
One of those places.
Yeah. And he's therefore very much understands the lives of working people and especially people in the gig economy. So a round of applause for our panel, please. For you, we've only got one rule for you. Less than 30 seconds with comments or questions, please. Any longer than that, then you're eating up someone else's time for the question, okay? So it's because you've got a wee bit longer to answer, but that's the only rule for you. Okay, I've got a question each for you, and then we'll open up. I want as many questions as possible from the audience. So Patricia, was there anything that was missed in that film? Or is there something that you'd like to highlight, the most important thing you think is the takeaway for the audience?
Yeah, so I think it was a great film. One of the things that I would say is that I believe MMT has been one of, if perhaps the only, economic theory that has kind of become popular on the back of activists primarily, not so much academics. And Stephanie Kelton talks about Siberia, and the truth is that while they were stuck in Siberia and blogging about these ideas, many ordinary people from very many backgrounds were self-teaching economics, trying to understand the issues of the time, particularly following the financial crisis, trying to understand, what had happened, and they started learning about this theory. And as one of them, I guess the first thing that happens when you suddenly start seeing the monetary system in this way is that, as Stephanie Kelton says, things become really clear. And things that had been previously framed in our political sphere as, well, inevitabilities of the system or, hard choices we have to make because we have to reduce the deficit, suddenly become clear as a political project. So things like unemployment being utterly gratuitous is framed as something completely necessary or inevitable. But that wasn't the thing that angered me the most. What angered me the most, I guess, is that outrage that kind of makes you go into action, is that I realized that we were being asked to debate policy in the public sphere and make decisions about future politicians and policies based on the wrong information. And very much, they were misleading us in terms of what the capacities of our economy is. And it may be that we still, we have varied views, and even within the MMT activist groups, there's very many views politically about what needs to be done. But at the very least, we have a common ground of understanding about how the economy works. And I feel that at country level, we're not even there yet. And it's really sad that we're not even there yet. So to me, MMT is primarily a democratizing project in the sense of making sure that people can make decisions with the right information.
Fantastic. Josh, there was a huge focus on the US there. Could you just briefly kind of explain what was relevant from the UK perspective and what was different?
Yeah, so I've co-authored a very long, technical, slightly boring paper on the mechanics of the UK system. I believe one of my co-authors is in the audience. Richard, put your hand up. There he is, over there. And the conclusion from that paper really was there aren't really any fundamental differences in the UK monetary system from that you've just watched in this film. We have different terminology. So we have a fund called the Consolidated Fund, which has been around for hundreds of years, which is essentially a sort of overdraft that the government kind of takes money from when it spends, and the Bank of England draws a liability on this when it credits government bank accounts with newly created money, which are created in just the way has been described as new deposits in government bank accounts. So there's some different terminology. One thing the film didn't really talk about, what I thought was slightly missing, was the role of the rules that we've self-imposed on ourselves, that essentially means that any money spent by the government is essentially neutralised via issuing bonds. And actually the main role, well, one of the main roles of bond issuance is to neutralise the monetary balances that are created, the new money that is created by the government. And in the UK we have a thing called the full funding rule, which means any money that is spent, new money that is spent by the government at the end of the day, that is not destroyed effectively somewhere else in the economy by taxes, has to be essentially taken out of the economy by issuing bonds to the exact amount of that sort of balance, basically. Now, the rationale for this full funding rule is two. One is this idea that any government spending is inflationary, which is deeply embedded in modern capitalist systems, based on historical examples which are pretty suspect in my view, and I've done quite a lot of research on this, but I won't go into that right now. But there's another function, which is to essentially ensure that the interest rate set by the central bank is passed on by commercial banks into the rest of the economy. And that's because when the government spends, it creates new reserves in the banking system and can affect the interest rate that banks borrow reserves from each other. And so there is a rationale for this full funding rule. However, one of the key points we make in the paper is that that rationale only applied up until around 2006, in the lead up to the global financial crisis, because during that period the government changed the way it ran the monetary system in quite a fundamental way, and it actually flooded the banking system with reserves via the process of quantitative easing, which meant that the number of reserves in the system became much less important for the transmission of the interest rate. So one of the key arguments at the end of the paper is, well, this full funding rule no longer is so relevant, actually. The rationale for it, aside from these sort of inflationary arguments, doesn't really apply anymore. So I felt that was one point that was somewhat missing from the film. Having said that, I thought it was a fantastic film, and there's always this delicate balance between engaging the audience and basically boring them to death with highly technical detail, which I've probably just done with my sort of description of the reserve market, and everyone's probably thinking, what on earth are reserves? So anyway, I thought it was great. I thought, essentially it does capture, essentially it's the same thing. I think there are slightly different constraints on the UK as a sovereign monetary issuing nation, but I'll leave it at that because I don't want to talk for too long at this point.
Fantastic. So if 3 hours is not long enough, you can go home and read the self-financing state this evening. Well, Zack, you've got the easiest question, I think. You're our elected politician on the panel. What did you think of the film?
I thought the film was great. I think I'd really like to see a UK version, and maybe particularly because you've written a paper on it or gone more into it, I think there's an obvious purpose for that. I think the fact it used humour was excellent. I think this is the game, isn't it? How do you engage people, teach people in a non-patronising way that have all sorts of experience and ideas around how the financial system works and how money works, speak about the difference between currency issuers and currency users, and balance all of those quite complicated conversations, but make it in a compelling narrative. And I think it did that really well. I think, having recently reread Stephanie Kelton's book, The Deficit Myth, it was interesting to see it at times pretty much going chapter by chapter. I think your red ink is our black ink, or their black ink was literally a direct quote. In terms of what I felt was missing, you didn't ask me that, but I still want to jump on it. There's a really interesting chapter in the book called You're Entitled, which talks around social security. Now, obviously, that's less relevant for us in the UK in some ways, although obviously still very relevant in terms of welfare. But I think it's this difference between a job guarantee and something like a universal basic income, and I think there's a really interesting conversation there around how do you make sure that people have work, and that that's a way of tackling inflationary pressures, particularly if you're looking at things like care work, which is work that we really need anyway and has social purpose. But also at the same time, I think there's a difficult line there, we were just talking about it earlier, where I don't think we should ever be going too much into an ideology of everyone has to work to have a purpose. And actually, I think there is legitimate reasons why people might not want to work in life or want to create art or music. And while that's a job, if you're not earning for it, then does that count? So I think there's more complicated questions I have, but I thought to answer your question, the film was really good. But I thought saying the film was really good was a boring answer.
No, that's perfect. Right, well, I'd love to open it up to, I'm going to start right at the back with the lady at the back. We don't have any microphones, but I think if you project, we'll all hear you perfectly. Go for it. So I'll just repeat that for the online audience. So what impact does MMT have for countries which aren't monetary sovereign?
Yeah, especially
The global south, okay. Patricia, do you want to?
Well, there happens to be quite a lot of MMT activist groups around the world. I hear, well, there's very strong ones in the EU and the Eurozone, particularly because of that, and as well as all over South America, Africa, and all over the world, really. And what MMT does in these countries, well, the basics would be to say that if you have a large amount of foreign denominated debt, so debt that is not in your own currency, but say in dollars, in US dollars, or if you are quite reliant on very basic imports from abroad, so food or fuel or anything like that, then, or you don't issue your own currency and you decide to just use the US dollar, for example, then you're not monetarily sovereign, and that highlights that you have restrictions that countries like the UK and the US do not have. What these groups in these countries have do with MMT is that MMT then informs what the aim should be, really. The first aim for these countries to be able to dictate their own future is to regain that monetary sovereignty. And that means reducing foreign denominated debt as much as possible, as well as making sure that you can issue your own currency, like in the Eurozone. So it sparks all this political action because it highlights where the problems are within the economy. But I will say that even in those countries that do have a large amount of foreign denominated debt, what they still have, and under the MMT narrative, they still have the capacity to utilize the resources that they have at home. So, for example, Argentina had quite a large amount of foreign denominated debt. They were still able to implement the job guarantee and make sure that everybody everybody that wanted a job could have a job and therefore feed their families and make sure that they had the basics. So there is still a lot you can do understanding MMT, even if you are in a country that do not have that is not monetarily sovereign.
Okay, so what's the relationship with reserves and paying interest on reserves and the transmission of monetary policy? Josh, that sounds like one for you.
Yeah. So the current way the transmission mechanism works is the banking system is flooded with reserves, and the banks and the central bank pays commercial banks to hold those reserves exactly the interest rate that the central bank is targeting across the whole economy, and commercial banks then use that rate maybe plus a tiny bit more when they trade with each other, and a bit more when they make loans. And of course, one of the results of that is when we reversed QE and when interest rates started going up, when we started buying bonds back into the market and raising interest rates, the costs to the bank, to the state, started to rise because the value of the bonds was falling, because the value of a bond and the interest rate are inversely related. That created a problem because we have in the UK a setup where the Treasury underwrites the liabilities of the Bank of England in the asset purchase facility, which is this fund where they're putting the QE purchased bonds. It's all a bit complicated. The bottom line is that liability doesn't really need to exist. And actually, that is one of the things that Rachel Reeves is debating getting rid of on the budget on the 30th of October. And it's an extremely important decision, because if she was to say the Treasury doesn't need to underwrite the billions of pounds worth of future liabilities from paying interest rates to these banks, it would actually free up, I think the estimates are between 15 and 20 billion of money, which would mean this crazy fiscal rule that we have would be much easier to observe. But one can also make a sort of inequality or equality argument here, an efficiency argument, and say why are we paying all this money to these banks that obviously don't need the money, because they create money, as we just found out from watching this film, and is that a good use of public money? And I would probably say no. The answer is it's not a good use of money, and so that's why I think calls for not paying those reserves or tiering the reserves, so only paying some of them, the sort of smaller, an initial amount that banks hold, or imposing a windfall tax have a lot of merit as well. Yeah.
Okay, I'll just add, in the last 2 years, we've paid 250 billion in interest on government debt, which is the GDP of Scotland. So it's a huge amount of money which is going on interest to government debt, and that tends to go to, of course, the already wealthy. And there's no fiscal rules around that. There's no limit for that like there is on other types of spending. I'm going to come down to the lady here with the glasses. Yes.
Yes,
okay. I love that assumption. I love that assumption. So assuming that economists aren't stupid, what's holding them back from embracing this? Yep.
I'll go initially. I imagine these guys will have a more technical answer. I'm just going to jump back off the last answer too, because I heard Josh's very technical answer, and my very simplistic version of that is it's outrageous that people who already hold the money can then charge interest on people to then take money. We're just making the rich richer and the poor poorer. So I just spent the last campaign, election campaign, and before that, essentially saying tax for rich. Let's tax multimillionaires and billionaires. People said over and over again, and I get it, that you don't need that money to fund public services, and that's absolutely true. But taxation can also be strategic. It can also be about making sure that if money is held in assets and it's stagnant, that can cause inflationary pressures later on. And actually taxing the rich is good in and of itself, not to fund public services, but something we need to do. Now, the way I'm coming to the answer to your question is during the general election, I was, again, telling these guys, I was in an interview with Victoria Derbyshire on Newsnight, and I just remember it was the day we'd launched the manifesto, and she wanted to talk to me about numbers, about how we were going to fund things. Now, we pushed the envelope out in terms of mainstream political discourse by putting a huge sum of money that we wanted to borrow to invest, and putting that in inverted commas. And the interview that she had with me, where I just couldn't get much more than a sentence out, was that we were doing the same as Liz Truss, we were going to crash the economy, and things were going to go terribly wrong. Now, Victoria Derbyshire is a smart journalist. Like, I imagine that I hope she knows better than the questions she was asking me. But she's also trying to create both an entertainment narrative, that's a whole other conversation we can have about media reform, but secondly, she's operating in the paradigm that the viewers understand, that the public understand. So politicians as well as economists have a huge job here to do, which is one, to shift that paradigm, and two, once you've shifted it, to then have the conversation within the new, what we call the Overton window. That's really difficult if you only have 30 seconds to give an answer, or even a minute. Of all the things in the video, was one of the first things she said, I think in the first 10 minutes, where she said, if I have an hour and a half, I can get people around in 2 hours. I was just thinking, what a luxury to have a room to be able to listen to for that long. So the gauntlet I guess I'm throwing myself, everyone in this room, the economists, activists, whoever you are, is we've got to find quicker ways of talking about this, better metaphors. If I think about the opposite argument, the idea of a household budget that Nick Clegg and David Cameron waved around during austerity, that was a very compelling narrative. It feels intuitive to people. I'm not saying it was just them. You can go back to Tony Blair and certainly Thatcher as featured in the film. These narratives are insidious. They've completely... they're present in every single political and economic conversation, and I think we've got to find new narratives that are just as intuitive. I'm not convinced the acronym MMT is it, but I think it's a good beginning to start going, okay, what is this new narrative? But these guys can probably give a more technical
I think
answer.
that's fantastic. I'll go to Patricia first. We'll just have the two answers and then please do, yeah.
Bill Mitchell, who is another one of the main MMT economists, he calls it groupthink, the whole way that why academics haven't accepted it. I'll be more sympathetic and say that we are asking a lot. We're asking academics to basically say that everything they've ever written is wrong. And it can be quite scary. So that plays a role of kind of that realization that you've wasted your time on quite a lot of things. And the other thing is ideology does play a role. Very often when you have private conversations with people and, when there's no pressure to understand these things and they understand the concepts of MMT quite easily, the reaction is not so much, I don't believe you. The reaction is very often, that's horrible. A lot of people have a lot riding on this idea of the free market, that there is this mythical free market out there that also brings some sort of cosmic justice to the economy. And if you burst that bubble, it's not just, it's pretty painful because you're rearranging a lot of their understanding of the world. And so this idea that basically saying that we are less free than we believe that we are, and that the government is actually coercing us into action, organizing the whole system and pulling the strings, basically. And that's quite difficult for a lot of people to accept, both left and right, I'm not going to say. But I think a combination of factors, but those are the main ones that I've seen.
Josh?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think there is also a vested interest issue here. You saw Larry Fink there. I'm pretty sure Larry Fink knows that the government creates money when it spends and knows that private banks create money when they spend. But he has got an interest in convincing governments that only the private sector asset managers can do the necessary investment we need to do the green transition or build houses or whatever it may be, because that's essentially how he's going to make money and grow his already enormous firm. I just want to say one thing on the tax thing, which I kind of think is important. I actually think, whilst I basically agree with the argument that we shouldn't think about tax as a way of getting money to fund the government, I think the way some US MMT sort of campaigning on this, talking about sort of framing it as we don't need to tax the rich, has not been helpful in bringing the progressive economist movement with it, especially here in the UK. And I do think that might have been a sort of maybe a strategic error to some extent. Very hard to know at the time that you might be having this unintended impact. I do think it's really important we understand that we will never do this massive structural transformation of the economy that is required to save the planet and save human society unless we pull resources away from where they are not needed. Quite a lot of which is wrapped up in what the rich are consuming, and move people out of industries where they're not needed and get them where they need to be and the resources where they need to go. And tax is absolutely key to doing that. So it's absolutely key tool for that.
I think we'll probably cover that. I'd like to hear from what you think then. You said you'd like to come back. If I could just briefly, very, very briefly, if you take an institutional approach to this, you see that, for example, a professor, if they want to get, or an associate professor wants to gain tenure, they have to get certain points, and you get more points for publishing a paper in a journal that is neoclassical. So you get 6 points for your tenure. If you try and publish something about MMT and it's published in a journal, you get 1 point. Okay, so if you're a professor, are you going to spend 6 months on a paper that gets you 1 point, or 6 months on a paper that gets you 6 points? So there's a whole kind of institutional support structure that forces or supports economists, especially academic economists, to go down a certain route. Neoclassical economics didn't win like a big competition. Right? It's a coincidence that it's the type of economics that supports the already wealthy and supports capital above labour. But there's a huge kind of underlying level that you can investigate. It's not just as simple as Patricia said. If you've been teaching this for 25 years, You don't just change your mind, and it's not a good feeling for someone to come up to you and say, you've been wrong for 25 years. No one says, oh, thank you so much for telling me. So there's huge issues, and one of my lecturers was a neoclassical economist, and he said it took him 10 years. He was teaching this stuff to bankers and to finance professionals, and they came up to him in the end and they said, you do realise this is all absolute nonsense that you're teaching? And he said, no, it's not. And then Stephanie Kellinger and he looked into it. So it's really, really difficult. And I think Zack's point is really important, because it's a lot easier for the general public to take this journey than it is for economists and academic economists. I'm going to take one from this side. There was a comment or a question. Did you want to add something, sir? A bit earlier, I think you said something.
I did shout out, and what about Labour? But that was to add to that question. So can you suggest what Rachel Reeves's attitude is?
To what?
To monetary theory.
Well, this shouldn't be a long answer.
Not interested, I think would be simple.
Should I go first? And I'll say unpleasant things, and then you can give a more charitable thing. Just very briefly, I think the vested interest thing is very interesting, because if you have a theory of economy, well, however you want to put it, that is existing right now that protects private capital, that moves money from the public sector away from the private sector, and those same organisations donate to the Conservative Party and to the Labour Party. We just heard the Labour Party got a £4 million donation from a hedge fund based in the Cayman Islands, with links to arms trade, private healthcare, and oil and gas, all the gang are together. Then it shouldn't be a surprise when that government, whether it's the Labour Party or the Conservative Party, then seek to protect the interests of those same companies that are not good for people and planet. And ultimately, I think it partly comes back to the reason why I answered your question in this way is, you're right to ask the academics, but also I'm a politician, so I always want to get the public on side. But you're right, we need those key experts on side too, to also be credibility for the public. So that's my answer, which is probably uncharitable, but it's how I see the two-party system right now. I don't know if you'd like to give a more generous answer to Labour.
We've only got 15 minutes, so let's snappy answers, please, so we can get some more questions.
I don't have anything else.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is the role of tax from a historical, but also like, I don't think there's much difference from historical to where we are now in terms of tax. Patricia, do you want to briefly address that one?
I mean, I think there's plenty of examples of colonialists, certainly in South America, where I'm originally from, of first the imposition of taxation, and then making that tax payable exclusively on the government-issued currency. And what that means is that then you can dictate what activities those people have to do in order to obtain that money, to pay that tax. So it's a much more efficient way of getting a large amount of people to do what you want than having to use people with whips and forcing them physically to do that. Sorry?
It's the carrot, basically.
It's the carrot, yeah. It's the carrot, but it's
I think
pretty violent carrot, yeah.
In the context of violence, it's the carrot.
Yeah.
So I would say, after you've read Josh's paper, if you can Google hut tax, and you'll see how the British Empire used exactly that when they were colonising Africa, with the need to pay a hut tax, or they would literally burn your hut down. So that was the role of tax and the role of money creation. Yes, sir, just up here, brief question, please. Yes. Yeah, Richard Murphy does some really great work on explaining what tax is in a much wider sense. It's slightly outside of the MMT framing, but our main message is that tax does not pay for government spending, and it's the thing that drives the value in the currency. Just at the back there, yes. So what should activists do with this power of the understanding that's from the film? Well, I suppose that's one for you, Zack. Do you want to go for that?
I mean, after I've said join the Green Party, but I think whether party politics are for people or not, I think to have conversations, so with friends, colleagues, neighbours, even just watching that film then, obviously it's something that's been on my mind for a long time, but I thought, do I talk about this enough outside of my work capacity? So actually just generally having, I was going to say at house parties, you might get kicked out of a house party, but in general conversations around money, just asking people, what was the question you suggested I asked a journalist earlier? I loved it.
What happens when the government spends money?
Yeah, exactly. So just to have those moments where I've always come at this from a place of, I've got to talk a million miles in a minute when a journalist asks me a question, but actually it'd be quite interesting to turn that round to the journalist and ask them some very basic questions. I then added it'd be even more interesting if I'm on with a minister to ask a minister questions about this. I accept that not everyone in this room gets time with journalists and ministers, so in terms of individual actions, I think it's probably joining an MMT group, whether there's localised groups, I'm guessing. I feel this is where I'm handing over now because I've reached for depth of my knowledge in terms of the organising.
I think in terms of when you always talk to politicians about, why don't you, and there are people who understand this, and included, a lot of the times you get, well, but I can't say that in public because people don't understand the world that way. So, and then you go to people and say, this is the way the world works, and then they ask, well, why don't politicians say that? So it's a bit like each other are waiting for the other one to speak first. Of course, academia also has a role to play with that. Academia has to endorse these ideas as much. So I think, basically, everything has to happen at the same time. People like you, Zack, have to be slowly, not necessarily all at once, but trying to speak about these issues in the media a bit more, as well as people demanding more of this from their own representatives. And that can mean, very many things. It can mean writing a letter to your MP about it, or it can mean helping disseminate this idea, like this documentary, right?
Yeah, I'm sorry, go on.
I was just going to be quite blunt and say if the Labour Party pursues continued policy of austerity in the budget on the 30th of October, get out on the street, basically, because this, that is just totally insane. It really is. I am hoping they won't. There are rumours that they will do more sensible things, but we'll see.
I was just going to briefly say the other insight I had watching the film is I'm sure lots of people in this room are involved with movements for other causes. And we know there's no environmental justice without racial, social, and economic justice too. All of these things come together. One of the most powerful images in that film for me was the colonialization narrative where the gun went down. I just found that a really powerful image. And I think being able to speak in other communities about the fact that this is also an issue of racial justice and it's to do with empire and colony. And I think joining those dots gets more and more people interested where they might have just rejected the idea of an economics conversation.
Fantastic. Well, I'm going to speak to our MMT advisory committee because we've got all your email addresses. So we're going to send you something that says this is what you can do to further this knowledge and some ideas. So that's a fantastic question.
Before I start with the gist of my question, I want to make sure I'm not an economist, so excuse me if my question is outlandish and stupid. Plus, I come from Eastern Europe. One thing that struck me was the emphasis on the importance of managing resources, sort of balancing money and resources, and controlling inflation. And she said that the key to that is very careful planning. Now, how is that different to, I don't know, Chinese state capitalism? Is she advocating for that sort of formula, or how is it different to socialism?
Okay, that's a very good question. Who wants to go for that?
That is a good question. China is the only country at the moment that is investing in green infrastructure, green energy at a pace and a scale that is actually compatible with the transition we need to make. And I think one of the main reasons for that is the banking system in China is controlled by the government. And when the government says you will make loans to put up solar panels across the Gobi Desert, they do it, and they don't care about the return they're going to get. Unlike Larry Fink's BlackRock asset manager and various other private investors, where even though the unit cost of electricity may now be competitive with fossil fuels, the actual yield, the return on those investments is still not competitive, and there's a big question about whether it ever will be. So there is a big question about whether we do need some kind of socialization of the financial system to achieve this, or just a much more expansionary approach to fiscal policy. So I haven't really directly answered your question. We obviously don't want to shift to a Chinese communist regime for political reasons, but yeah.
The very mention of planning.
Well, Ad, it's good. Do you want to go?
But I mean, I think.
You have to sell the idea. This is my.
No, I understand.
We're going to do that. I promise you, we're going to do that.
The word planning sends chills down the spine of a lot of people, because particularly if they believe that the market, the free market, which we've already said doesn't really exist, it's the best way of organizing resources in the economy. And when you say planning, you're going to say, what, you're not going to just let the free market do whatever it wants? And so a lot of people have this kind of aversion to it. We need to have a conversation as to, in this climate, climate change, the challenges that we face, what parts of the economy are we happy to leave it to the private sector, and what parts of the economy do we have to have them in public purpose? As Josh was saying, arguably money being a public utility, arguably that should be in public hands and it should be managed in the public interest. But you may not want to have ice cream, being produced by the government. You might want to leave that to the private sector. So, we need to have that conversation, and it may be that we land at a place where, similar to where we were, perhaps the Second World War is a good example, because what last time where we had to mobilize a lot of resources for a common cause. And we may have to be in a similar position if we're going to tackle climate change. And so we need to decide what that looks like.
Thank you. There's very traditional heterodox answer to your question, which is the economy is incredibly complex, and a modern economy can't function without planning, but we give all that planning over to multinational corporations. So you have to decide who's best to do the planning, more within the state, or are we still happy with these corporations doing all of our planning? And I think when you do that, you can reframe it slightly. Planning takes place, is it us, or is it the elite and the already wealthy? I'm going to move on to another question, if that's okay. The gentleman at the back there? Can I take that as a direct question? Why so timid on the economy?
Yeah, definitely. So I naturally disagree that we're timid, but I'll accept a free supposition.
You go along with this discourse of, well, I couldn't really say very much to Victoria Derbyshire. You've had months.
Well, I think that's definitely a paraphrase of what I said.
Yeah.
So,
let's attack that, because I think that's a really good question and a good point. So if you want
my point was that you can't get a sentence out unless you're within the paradigm, because they will immediately cut through to the point that you have. Hold on, you're doing it to me now. Where you won't get the microphone. You won't get the microphone, and you won't be able to finish a sentence. So it just ends up becoming an argument, which if a viewer watches, they go, oh, they don't know what's going on, do they? So you have to start going, if the narrative that you're pushing is more progressive, is more close to the truth, obviously truth is a tricky term, more close to what's actually going on, then that has to be positive. And ultimately, I don't think that's timid. I think that's going as far as you can go and pushing, constantly pushing the window. If you're so far out of the mainstream discourse, then you just don't get heard and you just don't get platformed. So, sure.
I'm going to move on, sir, if that's okay, because we've not got much time.
The mainstream discourse after the Second World War was Keynesian economics. And everybody in the world, in Britain for sure, agrees that that was amazing. We created the NHS, council housing, the welfare state. We can do that now. It's
Absolutely.
Not that drastic.
It comes back to what Patricia was saying, linking it to the climate crisis.
Thank you.
First, if I may, a quick comment rather about China that I've visited and studied quite extensively. Don't hold them up as a very good example of almost anything other than maybe the pace of green investment. Their banking system is potentially heading for collapse of a sort that we had in the GFC, but for different causes due to total non-performing loans or ghost cities of apartments that are not occupied and so on. But that's just a brief remark. But a question about banking in the West, and particularly UK banking, and the supervision and management and the rules around commercial banks and their lending. Now, we heard in the film that the banks should somehow be guided into lending more positively to the good things. How will you do that? And does that actually require them actually to be regulated back to being pure intermediaries, like, say, a building society with full reserves, rather than money creation through loans?
Thank you. Josh?
No, I would say. I think what we need are banks that make loans to productive, sustainable activities that we need for the green transition. Now, there's another question as, do we have the right institutional setup in the private banking system in the UK? I would certainly say we don't. We need a completely different ecosystem. We need small regionally based banks that will actually make loans to SMEs, that know the local economy, that will de-risk their loans because they understand that the small firm that they are lending to is creditworthy because they understand their business model, not because the owner is putting up his house as collateral, as most of them currently do. We need a big state investment bank, probably multiple state investment banks to do green, to do housing, to do infrastructure, not the very small funds that the Labour Party is currently talking about. And we need some form of credit guidance, I would argue, to steer the private banking sector as most high-income economies had in that 1950s to 1970s period when we grew our way out of this mountain of private and public debt without the inflationary consequences that everyone says or the inefficiency of allocation of capital that everyone says will happen if we don't have a highly liberalised banking system.
And central banks are doing some stuff. I know the ECB, for example, is looking to incentivise different types of investment. So there's a little bit of this work on the fringes, I think. Gentleman at the back there.
Yeah, so my question is, if we still operate within a system where production is for profit and exchange, then even if we're able to create sort of financial institutions which are linked to our activities, then how do we avoid the Jevons paradox whereby any sort of increases in resource efficiency in terms of carbon or land are simply just wasted by being reinvested in more production?
I can go very briefly to add to the problem. Going back to the election, we had a carbon tax that was on offer, and again, being with one journalist, we had to price how much that carbon tax might make. And then I obviously had to say, by the way, this is a signalling mechanism to the market. We don't actually want to get this money. We want people to reduce for big polluters, to reduce for carbon that they're trying to make. And then this becomes the exact problem. How do you cost, and we come back to planning a little bit, how do you cost for a future where you're asking polluters to pollute less, but you also need the money for that? And we've seen a little bit of that going on in London with the ultra-low emission zone. The mayor was pushed a lot that this was a revenue-making scheme, and he said, and I think he was right to say, it's absolutely not. The idea of it is that people drive less polluting vehicles, but also some of the money, the revenue that was created for it, should be going into a road user charging scheme or into public transport in London. Obviously, London isn't a currency issuer, it's a currency user, so it's a slightly different setup. Anyway, I've not given an answer to your question other than saying, yes, this is a problem. And now I'm going to turn to one of these two to make an incredible answer.
I don't know if it's incredible, but okay. I think you're speaking about the private sector's impairment to growth, right? And there is in green economy circles, there is this talk about degrowth. And now I'll be honest, I don't like the name of it because I don't think it's very informative, and I think it makes people think of unemployment immediately.
They don't like MMT, the degrowth.
Yeah, no, that's fine, it's mutual. But similarly to how we need to decide, what needs more planning, what needs to be more in public hands, and what needs to be in private hands, what is important enough to be in public hands, and vice versa. We need to decide how much growth we can afford to have within the environmental constraints, and therefore from that, say this is the size of the private sector that we can afford. Okay, this is the maximum, and everything else has to be done, publicly in a way that we don't basically get into what you said, just this cycle of increased growth.
Fantastic. Well, it's my duty to let you know that you can leave at any point. Thank you, Patricia.